This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to start out with is kind of give you where we're headed. And that is there's some interesting technology that's actually quite old, originated in Japan and 50 years ago, but recently has gained traction in the United States. And I'll take you a little bit through a journey that I've had where I've first gone to Japan to study under the experts, but a couple years ago we had some ideas of how to build a better mousetrap, and so my partner and I, Sean Whalen, who's actually in the entryway, he and I have put our heads together and developed a blood flow restriction product that we think solves a lot of the problems that were existing. So with that, let's get going. One of the things to say is that how long we live and how well we live is a function of our genes and our environment. And since at least at the moment we can't change our genes, we need to optimize how we interact with our environment to maximize health, wellness, and fitness. And one of these days we're going to have some pill that we can take, but there's problems with that kind of approach. The first thing to say about wellness and health and fitness is that we have to live ethical lives, that we are happy to have the sunshine principle or to have what our acts are exposed. So you have the 10 Commandments on the left-hand side, and you have the Golden Rule up on the right-hand side, and you have that other Golden Rule that really isn't appropriate to contaminate the thing. So once we have our ethics and honesty out of the way, then as general statements, the key to a long life, health and fitness and wellness can be stated as do's and don'ts. Don't use tobacco, particularly cigarette smoking. Don't do drugs, particularly pertinent during this current opioid crisis. Don't ride motorcycles or other risky physical behaviors. And what I mean by that is that there's, particularly in sports, the participation in that sports may be fun and may be rewarding, but there can be very serious long-term consequences. For example, as we see with the concussion problems that NFL players have had, as well as sports like alpine skiing or ski jumping that we'll see in a little bit. Race car driving, surfing, these things have hazards that can be fatal from time to time. On the other hand, what are the do's? Do alcohol in moderation and modestly. Great. So there's a lot of epidemiologic data that cultures that consume regular small amounts of alcohol actually live longer than those that either abstain or have excessive use of alcohol. Same thing for nutrition. Balance and moderation are really the message here, and so that's an important facet. And then what this talk is going to kind of focus on is do incorporate regular exercise into your lifestyle. And so this is kind of a cute little thing here where this guy's challenging why this guy believes the regular exercise is aging, and he's 147. So what happens when we age? There's a lot of not necessarily good things. There's a reduction in CNS or brain function, cognitive function, and also in the ability of the brain to control what aspects that it has to deal with, for example, body parts moving in various ways. And in the brain are what are called primary neurons, and then there are secondary neurons that take those commands to the muscles or information from in the peripheral nervous system, take it from the tissues back to the brain. There's a reduction in muscle fiber number and size, as well as the contractile function of each one of these muscle fibers. There's a reduction in tendon tensile strength, so much so that it's possible with normal activity to rupture tendons. There's a reduction in bone density, and we have a big medical problem with particularly senior women who have lost their bone density and as a result end up having fractures, and that carries its own morbidity and mortality. There's a reduction in capillary density, and this is the small blood vessels that surround pretty much all tissues. And this reduction in capillary density prevents the delivery of blood and clearing of waste that happens when we're younger. And then there's a reduction in mitochondrial density, and mitochondria are really the energy factories of the cells. And so ATP, or intracellular phosphates, are made in these mitochondria, and they power pretty much everything we do. And so if you look at from all the way up in this case, the motor cortex, all the way down the brainstem, out to the muscle, and then here, this is from the spinal cord out to the muscle, and each one of these fibers of a given motor unit are innervated by the motor neuron, and then this thing is connected to a tendon, and then there's a bone attached. This whole pathway, in various ways, various places along the way, end up degenerating over time, and particularly if they're not used. So there's a little truth to the better use it or lose it idea. So kind of honing in on one aspect of this, and that is the aging process when it has to do with motor neurons. And there's a reduction in the number of myelinated nerve fibers. Myelin is a substance that coats a lot of, you can think of it as insulation in a wire, and when these wires are insulated, their conduction velocity is greater, and they're basically better, quicker nerves. And then there's a decrease in nerve fiber diameter that also is probably related to this decrease in myelin. And then at the neuromotor junction, which is depicted here, there's a decrease in the number of these presynaptic vesicles which carry the neurotransmitters. And then these vesicles, when they come to when there's an their bioelectric charge coming down the thing, it releases the acetylcholine into this kind of space or nerve gap. And then on the other side of this, on the muscle, there's these nicotinic receptors that bind to the acetylcholine, and they're then discharge the muscle fiber. In addition to that, there's denervation of the motor fibers. So all of these things go away, but then in some cases, the nerve loses contact with the motor fiber, and then a lot of changes. A motor fiber or muscle fibers are very dependent on what kind of neural activity they're getting. And so when they become denervated, they just kind of shrivel up and go away. And then something that will be apparent a little bit later is this idea of converting fast twitch fibers or type 2 fibers into slow twitch fibers or type 1 fibers. So regular exercise can mitigate the age-associated changes to this neuromotor unit, but the intensity and duration of the exercise that is necessary to get these changes is rarely tolerated as we age. Then in addition, out of disuse, we have this kind of transition going on as, in my case, what I was 50 years ago is 50 pounds ago. So these things do creep up on you. As we age, there is one event after another. Maybe you fell alpine skiing on a nice vacation, which made you be sedentary for the next 3 months. Well, that 3 months of sedentary behavior caused a lot of the tissues to atrophy and maybe gain some weight, and then when you try to get back, you're not able to do the things that you were able to do in the first place. So in addition to that, we like to eat, and our appetite is more related to our activity and stuff like that, but there's a lag phase, so that when we become sedentary, we don't necessarily lose our appetite, and so then now we're in a positive caloric balance over time, and that's probably the main reason for this increase in weight. So, we think we have a solution for that, and it's called blood flow restriction training. And by restricting the blood flow and performing light, easy exercise that's doable in a short amount of time, one can gain the health benefits of intense, long-duration exercise. And so one of the ways to think about this is that we have kind of short-circuited the body's normal systems. And I'll explain more of that in detail as we go through this. But the key to all of these things is this disturbance of homeostasis in the working muscle. And what I mean by that is the environment that muscle operates in becomes disturbed, and it goes out of ranges of pH, temperature, a variety of other things that we'll mention briefly. This disturbance of homeostasis is the thing that stimulates local and systemic anabolic mechanisms. And so this is kind of where this no pain, no gain idea comes from. You have to really stress yourself before the body will say, oh, I've got some problem here, I better react to it, I better get better so that I can continue doing things. And then further, because typically the exercise that it takes to get this disturbance of homeostasis ends up doing damage, by doing the restricting blood flow and light, easy exercise, we don't get that damage, and so adaptation happens on a quicker time frame than usual. Here, this is a kind of a model of the system that Sean and I have come up with, and there's a couple things to point out here. There's basically a pair of arm bands, a pair of leg bands, a little pump to inflate these things, and very importantly, there's an app that can guide the person through these things so that, in essence, you don't need an expert around to take you through this stuff. B-Strong training systems are used by a wide variety of people, from adolescents to elite athletes, injured or operated patients, to baby boomers, to nonagenarians, and everybody in between. And here, these guys aren't exactly adolescent, they're 16 and 17 years old, but we use this down to pretty much 9-year-olds. And on the other hand, here we have a young lady, 95 years old, who's got her bands on and she's going for a walk with her walker. One of the things that is a really big problem that I think we can address is we have someone who's otherwise motivated to play sports, but their lifestyle between the job and family and work and everything else has just gotten to be so hectic that there's no time for them, even if they're motivated, to go out and do things. And then there's another group of general adults who we could characterize as couch potatoes, and they end up developing metabolic syndrome, what's something called metabolic syndrome, which is high blood sugars, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and obesity. And this is an entirely preventable problem by regular exercise alone, along with some good nutrition modulation. So one of the things here is, if we get back to this idea that regular exercise can fix these things, then but in many cases, regular exercise is too intense for people to do enough of to get the benefits. We've now figured out a way to shortcut that and to provide this exercise stimulus in a way that's doable for people. So one of the things to say is, anytime you're going to do something to another human, you want to make sure that you're safe. And blood flow restriction training in one form or another has been practiced for 50 years in Japan. Today there are approximately 300,000 blood flow restriction sessions daily in Japan, with no reports of serious complications. And this means that there's just a fantastic experience, and if there was going to be something bad happening, it would happen in this kind of population. In our particular situation, we've basically had systems that we've had out for approximately a year to a year and a half. We currently have approximately 1,500 systems out there, and for us, we've had tens of thousands of sessions with Be Strong and no reports of any serious untoward effects. There's a reason for that, and that is that the only way to get really serious effects is by occluding arterial inflow. So when you put our bands on, we want to make sure that what we're doing is we're adjusting the circulation in just the right way to optimize the effects. And for many of the other devices, some of them, for example, started out life as surgical tourniquets, which are very good at occluding arteries, so you don't have bleeding all over the place. They have to go through quite a rigorous thing to avoid this occlusion of the arterial inflow, and their way of doing this is they end up tethering you to a stand where there's a Doppler flow meter that assures that flow is never totally occluded. But anyway, so if you do shut off blood flow for an extended period of time and some other things happen, it's possible to do severe muscle damage, and the end of that spectrum is something called rhabdomyolysis, and that can end up putting you in renal failure, needing to go on dialysis, or it can cause arrhythmias, cardiac arrhythmias, which can lead to death. In addition, it's possible to get deep venous thrombosis or DVTs, and then these DVTs can migrate into the lungs and cause pulmonary emboli, which also can be fatal. So as long as we stay away from occluding the arteries, we're in good shape. So we have designed these things specifically not to occlude the arterial inflow and by up to the maximum capacity of our hand pumps. So this way we're eminently safe and the safest BFR devices on the market. One of the other things to say is that safe in comparison to what? Where we get the same results you get from really heavy lifting with very trivial light exercises. And this guy's not 90 yet, but he's 87, and this weight looks like it's going to fall on his foot or hurt his back. And this little ball's not going to do much. So blood flow restriction training is safer than the standard kind of training that we had out there. So now let's get into a little bit of the mechanism, because it's not quite straightforward. But obviously with blood flow restriction training, we want to restrict blood flow, but we want to do it in a specific way. What we want to do is, at rest, we want to block the veins from blood getting out of the extremity. But if you just block the veins and then let things go their way, first a limb would engorge or distend with blood that's coming in from the artery and nothing's getting out. And if that went on long enough, the artery would stop because there's no more room to put anything in. So then what we have is this muscle contraction. So when you do a muscle contraction, you're actually squeezing the blood in the muscle, and you're sending it somewhere. And because of the valve system in the veins, where it goes is it overflows the venous blockade, and you end up changing the character of the venous flow from what I kind of call a lazy river, where it's kind of continuous, to one in which it's blocked for a period of time, and then with muscle contraction, all of a sudden, all this blood is pushed out of the extremity, and so you actually get almost pulsatile venous flows going from 0 to very high rates. And this actually is preventative for any kind of clot formation, because what you're doing is you're flushing this thing out repeatedly and keeping the thing moving. But in many ways, what we've done is we've just slowed down and inhibited the blood flow, so that when we have this situation, the exercising muscle is not going to get the blood it normally gets, nor needs to continue contractions. This is the bit again about what we do is we actually, by putting these bands on, we don't really change resting flows. But normally when you go from rest to exercise, the arterial inflow picks up. And we're really preventing that increase from happening. And then to all said and done, these vascular changes result in an angiogenic stimulus, building more and better blood vessels. And I'll show you some data later on that kind of indicates this. So the working muscle, the bottom line is the working muscle is denied the blood flow it normally needs to sustain these contractions. So what happens in this muscle? Now, this is where the disturbance of homeostasis takes place. And I'll show you some information about the amount of oxygen in the muscle goes down, the pH, or the amount of the pH goes down, the amount of acidity goes up, and the intracellular phosphate stores are depleted. In addition, the lactic acid is increased, as well as inorganic phosphate, which is a breakdown product from these intracellular phosphates. Taken together, these changes produce a metabolic crisis, which has several main consequences. As these early motor units fatigue, faster and bigger units must take over the work, eventually leading to recruitment of all muscle fibers in a muscle. And this is actually important because generally you can divide the world into type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers, or slow twitch and fast twitch. And normally when we're doing everyday activities, we're relying on our slow twitch muscle. And those fibers being activated are very dependent on the blood supply. And you go along, you're a happy camper, and you're able to do work. But if you're doing intense exercise or heavy weightlifting or long duration things like marathons, you end up needing to tap into these faster twitch fibers. And the only way that those fibers get trained is by having contractions. So when you're thinking of explosive sports or very, very big strength-oriented tasks, you need to use all the fibers in the muscle to do this. And so it's very hard to recruit these. But we found a way by restricting the blood flow that we start having these faster and bigger units have to take over the work because the easy ones or the early ones have dropped out. And so this leads to total recruitment of all fibers of the muscle. Also, this disturbance of homeostasis stimulates local protein synthesis in an attempt to repair the damage that's being done. And in addition, the cell surface, anabolic cell surface receptors are upregulated so that now this muscle fiber has these little catcher's mitts on its surface looking for anabolic hormones to come by and activate even more protein synthesis. In addition, this signal of distress is sent to the CNS versus a kind of afferent nerve fibers called group 3 and group 4. So we'll get into a little bit of this here. This is a technique called near-infrared spectroscopy. For those of you who have been in a hospital setting and somebody has put a little pulse oximeter on your finger to see that you're saturated with oxygen on the arterial side, here, this is the same sort of thing, but instead of looking at moving blood, this is looking at hemoglobin that is in the muscle itself. So these numbers give you an idea of what's called SMO2, or the saturation of oxygen in the muscle, so in a percent thing. And so here we have just regular exercise, doing arm curls, and normal levels of oxygen in muscle at rest are about, let's say, 65%. And then you start doing exercise, and it drops down in the mid-30s. And then you stop and rest a little bit, it comes back up. And this kind of goes back and forth here, but you kind of see the baseline. As you get warmed up, you actually don't go down as far, and when you recover, you're going up even higher. And then when you really stop, you've got this recovery hyperemia where you have very high levels of oxygen in the muscle. If you do that with blood flow restriction bands on, we're starting out more or less in the same place again. and then you just put the pressure into the band, and all of a sudden it's dropped the oxygen without any exercise. And here we continue on with some of the exercise, and now instead of in the mid-30s, we're in the mid-20s. We continue to increase the pressure, and the muscle gets worse and worse, and before you know it, we're really down in the basement. This is extreme hypoxia, which is a very good stimulus for, number one, causing a disturbance of homeostasis, and number two, stimulating protein synthesis. This is some other data from nuclear magnetic spectroscopy and identifying this sort of thing. If you look over here, these are spectra that go from, without any kind of blood flow restriction, from rest to exercise. And what you see is that inorganic phosphate peak is increased from rest to exercise, and the phosphocreatine peak is severely reduced, indicating this kind of use of phosphate in the muscle, or the ATP. And these are the curves for ATP, and they're down a little bit as well after exercise. But then if you restrict the blood flow to this muscle, now all of a sudden the inorganic phosphate peak is much higher, and the remaining phosphocreatine is much lower than the comparable thing where blood flow is going on, and you still have the ATP curves showing degeneration. So between the last slide and this one, this shows that muscle with blood flow restriction training gets very hypoxic and basically runs out of its energy stores. Now, so this gets back to what the consequences of those kind of things. So when the PO2 gets to a certain point and when the energy stores empty out, then those muscle fibers that are working, they just stop. They fail. They can't do it anymore. And that is the typical kind of thing that you see over here. These are arm curls, tricep extensions. But then as these fibers drop out, you start recruiting faster and faster and faster fibers, still using the same easy weights. And before you know it, you're getting into the same fiber populations that you're using with very explosive, powerful movements. Kind of depicting this thing in another way, the typical way for recruitment and fatigue pattern is if you use light weights or you increase the weight and increase the weight, you get more and more of these fibers contracting until you need to use very heavy weights and near maximal weights to contract all of the fibers in the muscle. Blood flow restriction recruitment and fatigue pattern is such where the weight stays the same, but because we have restricted the blood flow, now these early fibers, they start to drop out, and you recruit faster and faster fibers, and before you know it, with light weights, you're recruiting the same percentage of fibers in the muscle that you are with really heavy weights. And this is actually one of the big take-home points, that essentially we can become trained with very light weights and blood flow restriction to the same extent that you can with heavy weights. So this is a little bit more of the mechanism. This is the mTOR pathway. The thing to point out here is that the reduction in energy stores and the reduction in oxygen or hypoxia are very strong stimuli in this pathway to activate the mTOR pathway that ends up resulting in protein synthesis. In addition, these self-surface receptors are activated and upregulated, so they're looking for growth factors to come along and amplify the process. So, what we really have, the next aspect of this, and by the way, the point of showing this slide is that our bands go anywhere and can be used anytime. She's actually doing handstand push-ups, which is quite remarkable. And on top of that, she's 57 years old. She happens to be my wife, but... So there's something called a systemic neuroimmunohormonal response, or an anabolic response, And by triggering this disturbance of homeostasis message is sent up to the brain, and the brain then releases this systemic response. And there's autonomic hormones and anabolic hormones that end up then going throughout the body. And that will be important in some of the data that I show a little later. So this systemic response amplifies these local responses to upregulate protein synthesis, and any muscles that were exercising, whether their blood flow was restricted or not, adapt to this situation. Because little damage was done, there's an increase in strength and fitness very quickly. So if you think of all of our processes, it's a balance between breakdown and buildup. And under normal training circumstances, we get some breakdown along with the stimuli to build up, and things pretty much progress. If, for example, you end up getting a trip to the space station, then all of a sudden the buildup stops because you're not doing any exercise, but the breakdown, the body recognizes that it doesn't need all these things that are up there, so you end up losing bone density, you lose blood volume, you lose muscle mass, you lose cardiac mass just by spending 2 weeks on a space shuttle mission. So anyhow, whoops, let's see. So what we have here is that this balance between breakdown and buildup is altered in favor of building up, and so the changes that occur happen readily and on a relatively quick time scale. So, for example, as few as 5 sessions of blood flow restriction training can end up prompting an increase in strength and fitness. So, again, I had stressed this earlier, all tissues that were involved in the exercise, whether they were proximal or distal to the blood flow restriction bands, enjoy this systemic anabolic action. So this is a kind of a cartoon that depicts this problem. So here's this muscle doing arm curls with a blood flow restriction band in place, and this disturbance of homeostasis is being communicated through metaboreceptors all the way up into the brain, rattles around up here for a while, and there comes out a sympathetic response that increases sweating, increases heart rate, increases breathing, and that's one thing. But in addition, there's a reflex that ends up through the hypothalamus and then into the pituitary, releasing a number of anabolic hormones, including growth hormone, that then again go throughout the body. And this basically shows this. And here we have, this is whole blood lactate, and the open squares are the control exercise, where it's just exercise alone. And then with the same exercise, but the blood flow restriction bands in place, you have a much more, or a highly significant increase in blood lactate. And lactate itself stimulates protein synthesis in the tissues that it's being generated. In addition, coming back to some of these vascular changes, here we see that VEGF, or vascular endothelial growth factor, is stimulated by the blood flow restriction training, which you see in the closed or filled-in circles here, compared to the control exercise itself. And these two things are basically local effects, or examples of the local effect that we were talking about earlier. But then now here we have the systemic effect. So here this is growth hormone, and the control exercise, or the same exercise, when there's no blood flow restriction bands in place, has this nice little gray line, and basically nothing's moving. And here, this is before the exercise, this is after the blood flow restriction training, and here you have at 10 minutes and at 30 minutes, very robust increases in growth hormone production. And this growth hormone then goes, among other places, to the liver, where it stimulates an increase in IGF-1, or insulin growth factor 1, which is also a very anabolic substrate. So taken together, here you have some indications of a local effect and also evidence of a systemic effect that is highly anabolic. So that's nice, and that's a nice story, but how does this really apply, and how do we actually make this happen? And on January 10th, 2014, this is one of my athletes not having a good day, and he ended up breaking his arm, and he has a comminuted humeral head fracture, and you can kind of see there's like 5 different pieces here. And he also broke a rib. He also had a bit of a head injury, and he tore the labrum of his rotator cuff. So here's where the labrum would normally be. And essentially what he did is, in this particular piece, this is where a muscle called the subscapularis inserts. And so he just ripped that whole thing all out. And this happened on a Friday in Germany. He flew back to Park City, Utah on Saturday, and he saw our shoulder orthopod on Sunday. And the doc said, Todd, I really need to go in there and put some screws and plates in there, and I need to fix it. But if that's the case, you're not going to the Olympics. And Todd had been, from the date of this thing, this is 2014, so the opening ceremonies for the Sochi Olympics were February 7th, 2014. 4 weeks from the time of this injury. And normally this kind of thing is a season-ending injury. If he was operated on, it would be 6 months rehabilitation under normal circumstances. Well, Todd didn't like that answer. And I had been working with this stuff. This actually was with the Katsu equipment. And we said, okay, well, let's give Katsu a try. And if it doesn't work, then you can go put your screws in. And his season's ruined anyway. But this is the only way that we might be able to get him back to compete in the Olympics. And Todd is, at this time, is 37 years old. This would be his 6th Olympic Games. And most likely his last one. So he wanted to do everything he could to make the team. And so what we did is we started twice a day. Todd was used to working out twice a day. So now, and as is typical with any injury, all of a sudden you have to stop what you're normally doing. And that is very hard on these athletes. There's a lot of atrophy that happens when that occurs. And even if we got his shoulder to heal, the time off from normal training that would happen in his time period would ruin any kind of performance that he might have in the Olympics. And so here we're doing, basically what we do is with any injury, we want to train all 3 normal extremities as much as possible while not causing any problems with the healing site. So he's immobilized in a sling, and you can kind of see here he's got a hand grip in his left hand, and so he's actually doing forearm exercise while he's doing a pulling motion with his right arm. And one of the keys to this kind of exercise is that it's exhaustive. And this is exhaustion from the exercise as opposed to anything in his shoulder. And Todd is what's called a Nordic combined athlete, and so he ski jumps and he cross-country skis. And here he's practicing what he would be doing with his on a ski jump, but with the bands on and his shoulder immobilized in a way that we're not causing any pain in the shoulder. And then similarly, here we have a treadmill you can roller ski on. That simulates cross-country skiing, and normally he'd be using poles, but he can't on his left side, and so we're doing exhaustive intervals with this kind of thing. And these workouts are exhaustive, but they're not. If he were doing a normal kind of thing, they wouldn't be tolerated. Long story short, the opening ceremonies were on February 7th. And Todd was elected flag bearer for the United States team. And just to annoy me, he's carrying the flag in both his right and left arm. And we were following him along with x-rays. So this was 3 days after the opening ceremonies in Sochi, and we got a regular x-ray. And you can see this piece is not where it's supposed to be. But what is amazing is we're starting to see callus formation and ossification across the main fracture site. And so this is really early healing. And why would that be? One of the principles is we immobilize the fracture, we don't move it so it has the best chance of healing. But we feel that this systemic response that we elicit by this very hard, intense exercise produces a hormonal milieu which optimizes the rate of healing. And to further illustrate this, this is now February 12th, and here he is doing an Olympic practice jump, and his left arm is not doing exactly what the right is, but if you remember, when you try to heal these fractures, you have to internally rotate and fix the arm here. But if you try to go off a ski jump with your arm like this, you'd probably do the same thing on the other side that he did in the first place. So over time, we had to externally rotate the arm and be able to put it back so that he could get into a normal jumping position. And all of this stuff we did without any pain in the fracture site. This is a week later, and now but there's now even more bone healing that's going across this fracture site. And he has no pain in his shoulder, and he's able to cross-country ski, and he's able to ski jump. So then on February 20th, 40 days after the injury, he ends up placing well in the jump portion of the Nordic Combined competition. And he skis 5 kilometers. The event was a 5-kilometer cross-country ski race, which under the best conditions he might do in 12 minutes and 10 seconds or 12 minutes and 15 seconds. And he was able to complete it in 12 minutes and 28 seconds. And basically, this is unheard of progress in a very short time frame to be able to be competitive in an Olympic Games with fracture an injury as he had. So that's kind of the dramatic kind of application that we have. And now let's look at some of the literature about this. So this is an article that came out in the Journal of Applied Physiology in the year 2000. And I want to kind of go through these graphs in detail. What we have here on the x-axis is basically the speed of the movement, and on the y-axis, the amount of torque generated. So, and where you have negative speeds, that's extension of the arm. Where you have positive speeds, it's flexion of the arm. And what you see here is if you take an untrained control group and you test them twice with 4 weeks in between, they basically have no change, and it's a very reproducible test. So now going on the other side of this is standard weight training. This is about using 80% of a 1-rep max. It's a bit of an artificial situation, but it's typical along with the kind of recommendations that we get for normal strength training. And here we have the pre-training values, and then what we see is at all speeds, there's a significant improvement in strength or torque generation with standard heavy lifting or high-intensity training. Then on the other hand, if we use low-intensity training, and instead of 80% of 1 rep of maximum, we use 30 to 40% of maximum. Here we have not much is happening. There's a little bit of an increase, but basically, easy weight training really doesn't cut it in terms of improving strength. But if we add blood flow restriction to the same weights that were added here, now all of a sudden we have the same kind of advantages that we get with the heavy lifting. So you saw that graph where the Olympic lifter was kind of losing control of the weight. That kind of training compared to the stuff that 87-year-old guy was doing with a big exercise ball, you end up getting the same percent improvements in strength. This is an amazing finding to be able to use very light training that's possible for particularly seniors, and to get these dramatic improvements in strength. Another study that recently came out showing essentially the same thing is now this is with high school students, and they were doing back squats. And the conditions here are they had low intensity work, less than 30% of one repetition maximum, or heavy work, greater than 65% of one repetition maximum, or the combination of this kind of weight training plus BFR. And what you see here is that the low intensity weight training with the BFR actually has a robust improvement in the amount of weight that they could move pre and post test, where light weights by themselves did nothing, and you had a good but not as good improvement in strength with the heavy weights by themselves. And this is consistent. This is the same kind of results that we got on that first slide that I showed you. And again, the reason for this probable difference, the reason it's even better, is because we're not doing damage to the tissue when we're working it out. And so you don't have to kind of repair the damage that was done before you can go on and do more. So not only that, here we have this on the x-axis here are days. And they were doing a BFR workout once a day. And what you see is compared to the same weights, light training alone, but light training with Katsu, there's an increase in the muscle bone cross-sectional area that is happening very rapidly. And so this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. By a week, they had actually gotten to significant gains compared to the control situation. So very quick thing. And that is also consistent with this idea that we're not doing the damage, so we don't have to repair the damage first and then get better. We're getting better right from the get-go. And here we have something else that is kind of unusual. This is where they're doing a bench press, one repetition maximum, and here's the percent change in strength. And this is basically lightweight training, and then this is the same training with the BFR. But what's interesting here is you use both your pecs and your triceps to do a bench press. The triceps have their blood flow restricted, but the pecs don't. They're well above the thing, and both of these muscles are showing improvements in strength and improvements in cross-sectional area. So here we have improvements in strength and in size of muscle from this. Muscle is attached to bone. And here we have, in a different study, they were studying leg press, and they had, with Katsu, they had a nice improvement in leg strength over control where there was really no change. And in thigh cross-sectional muscle, again, a nice significant improvement in thigh cross-sectional area of muscle compared to the control. But then also we have a significant improvement in bone-specific alkaline phosphatase. And this is an enzyme that's used in bone turnover. And when this is going up, it means that something's happening to the bone, and indicating that there's increased bone turnover and likely improved bone density as a result of this. Here's IGF-1. In this case, it's not statistically different, but still an increase. So now we have positive changes in muscle. We have positive changes in bone. And we have positive changes in building new and better blood vessels. What we have here is mRNA expression on this axis, and these are markers for vascular endothelial growth factor, its receptor, something called HIF-1 alpha, which is a hypoxyl inducible factor, and then various isoforms of the nitric oxide synthase system, which is also, all of these things are involved in building new blood vessels. And so what you have here is the open bars are with blood flow restriction training, and the black with the same kind of weights but no restriction. Another kind of neat study, and of all places coming out of Iran, But basically what they did is they took these poor little rats and they tied off their femoral arteries. Okay? And then they made them run on treadmills. And so this is their model for restrictive blood flow training. And what you see, this is an indication of muscle hypertrophy. What they did is they sacrificed the rats after a few sessions, and then they measured the ratio of the size of, in this case, the soleus muscle and the EDL, or extensor digitorum longus muscle, in these rats. And this sixth condition over here is treadmill walking or jogging on a little rat treadmill with the blood flow restriction conditions, where these things are various control situations. And this one over here, this third graph here, is just blood flow restriction alone without the treadmill walking. So, but here we have very significant results with a form of blood flow restriction training in these rats. And then also we have the receptor for the neural transmission of the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. And if you recall back on that slide where I was talking about what's happening to the motor nerves, this is indication that these receptors are coming back, and you're increasing the receptors with this form of blood flow restriction training. And I must say that when you tie off the femoral artery in a rat, it doesn't mean the whole thing dies. It just means that their blood flow is restricted. They're not able to get the normal amount of blood flow with exercise that they otherwise would. So this is in a rat model, and this is showing that the same kind of thing is happening in rats as to people. So now we've had a tremendous experience with this sort of stuff, and this is some of the different kinds of people that we're working with. This guy had a bad knee injury from playing soccer, and you can see here he's doing arm work, and it's hard to see here, but this is his right leg is in a stocking that he's using to keep down swelling in the injured side. This gentleman was in the Pentagon on September 11th, and he's also a Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, and he has post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he ends up claiming that this is the only way that he gets some of his relief. This guy has two things going on. One is, at one point he had a PRP and stem cell ejection in his shoulder. He happens to be 81, and he also had a total knee replacement. And so this is a very good therapy for total joint replacement, as well as some of these things. This young man had low back pain, and he had an MRI that showed there's these discs bulging into his spine, and his orthopedic surgeon said, well, we should operate on this and we should take him out. In the meantime, he showed up at our clinic, and he ended up doing a Be Strong program, and then he was scheduled for surgery. He dutifully went down and was on the gurney, and he goes, wait a minute, doc, I don't think I need this anymore. And the guy goes, what are you talking about? And he says, well, here, look. And he got off the gurney and bends over and touches his toes and says, my back's not hurting. And the surgeon says, get out of here. And so in literally the 2 weeks between the time he had his appointment with the orthopedic surgeon and the time that he was due to be operated on, we were able to take his pain away. This is an example of using 4 bands in training in a otherwise healthy young woman. And this young man had rotator cuff repair surgery. And again, showing the same sorts of kind of things. So the theme here is that almost no matter what's wrong with you, we end up being able to address it with blood flow restriction training. These are actually 2 nurses. And this one happens to suffer from osteoarthritis, and this one from rheumatoid arthritis. Doing the Be Strong system got her out of the wheelchair. She has eliminated the pain that she normally has in her hands, and so it's effective for that kind of thing. And in addition, this kind of easy lifting or strength training is something that's possible for these women, where the normal kind of training that you might want to do to improve this kind of strength is just impossible to do. More of these cases. This guy's 83, and he had a shoulder repair. She's in her mid-50s, and same sort of thing. And you'll notice that in many of these cases, there's bands on both arms and legs at the same time. This guy had ankle surgery and was interested in getting his golf swing back, and we were able to allow him, where before with his foot, he was in so much pain that he couldn't do anything, got operated on, and then to rehab him, we ended up using these Alter G treadmills in the back as well as the Be Strong, and now he's playing better than he ever has. Again, here's one of our guys doing more vigorous exercise with the bands on, and this is the total knee replacement, our total joint. This young lady had low back pain and ends up not having it anymore. He had a rotator cuff repair and a total knee replacement. So here's also some fascinating things. This is one of our women jumpers who had a fall, and she had a fracture in her thoracic spine. She did not have any spinal cord damage at the time, but we were doing the Be Strong exercises that she could tolerate without having her fracture hurt, and she's now back to normal. This young man over here is in his mid-60s, and he had a cardiac arrhythmia. The long story ended up, he was taken to the cardiac surgery thing, and he had a median sternotomy where they opened up his chest to repair what was going on. And in addition, he has ankylosing spondylitis of the neck. And before he was doing the Be Strong stuff, and before he had his cardiac surgery, his head was bent over. He could not get his neck into this normal position. And we were able to, again, doing exercise gently that didn't disturb the healing tissues, we were able to bring him around. This guy in the middle was a complete quadriplegic, and he had suffered he was surfing, and he ended up getting dumped on his head on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and he was, for 2 years, he was in a spinal cord injury rehab unit and unable to walk and everything else. And little by little, it wasn't a complete lesion, but we were able to bring him back. And with doing this, and I don't know if you saw this, but we take these things to absolute exhaustion and failure. And so he's really working it there. And we were able to get him back so that he's just walking as normal. So in addition, this stuff is good for any kind of exercise. It just amplifies the effect. Here is roller skiing on the treadmill again with all 4 bands on, cycling with leg bands on. And in this little video, this is swimming in the Pacific with the bands on. And these are Be Strong cuffs, that we don't want them to inhibit the normal technique that's being used, but they go anywhere in any kind of environment. Some more cases. Both these are cases of ACL repairs, and in this case, a professional goalkeeper for the New York City Football Club. And in this case over here, Ted Ligety is one of our Olympic gold medalists in skiing. this is doing these kind of easy exercises, and it's his left knee that had the ACL replaced, and this is 2 weeks after the surgery. And you can kind of see that his legs are about the same size. That's kind of unheard of. Same thing for Ted here. The character of this stuff is that these are very exhaustive exercise. This simulates his alpine skiing, where basically you're flying down these slopes on a very unstable surface, and you have to use a lot of muscles to do this. But you couldn't ask him to go alpine skiing right now because it would likely tear up his repair. But here we can take him to exhaustion in a protected way and get him back to doing this kind of stuff. So here we have one more of these things, and this is when it's used as a training device. She's not particularly hurt here, but we have a alpine ski simulator, and doing it with the band on just magnifies the difficulty of the work, and here she is bent over, exhausted. She's another one of our gold medalists. So, okay, how do you make this thing work? So our prescription is basically a 20-minute whole body BFR exercise session 3 times a week, first thing in the morning before the day starts getting away from us, and in the convenience of your own home. So it's very convenient. It's before you take a shower. Everything's going on, and or you can take your Be Strong kit and the TheraBand, and you can do this anytime, anywhere, whenever you happen to be, whether you're on the road, whether you're over in Europe, whether you're at the office or at home. And so you recover quickly from these kind of workouts. Even though they're exhaustive, you recover quickly so you can manage the other things that are going on in your day. So the product that we made is affordable, it's easy to use, it's comfortable, it's time efficient, effective, and above all, it's safe. Here we have the same thing that basically is saying the same sort of message, where we basically take these bands that are suited for you. We use light loads, and by working these muscles, we end up getting this systemic response, and we don't get the damage that it would otherwise take to do that. There's a couple of higher-end systems. This is Katsu, and this is something called Delphi. And these things are in the thousands of dollars, where ours are in the hundreds of dollars. And then there's a lot of little wraps and straps and all sorts of things out there. They are affordable, but they're unlikely to be safe, and they're unlikely to be effective compared to our situation, where we have this controlled with a pump and an app to guide you through it. So it's a pretty simple process. Our app can be obtained at app.gobestrong.com, and you put the bands on, and then you do generally you're looking to get muscular failure in 15 to 20 minutes. And the general protocol is 3 sets of 15 to 30 reps and doing it on 3 to 5 different exercises. So, in summary, Be Strong BFR is safe. There are no contraindications to a Be Strong BFR session other than ongoing medical emergencies, and you ought to go to the hospital if you're having a heart attack. For recent injuries or operations, train the 3 uninvolved extremities normally and exercise the injured or operated tissue gently without pain. Be Strong BFR works. BFR is effective in improving strength and fitness, even when normal training methods are not possible, as in Todd's case. Blood flow restriction training can improve all tissues, from the nerve to the muscle to the blood vessels to the bone. Here we have Be Strong BFR is portable, comfortable, and convenient, able to be used with any exercise. Be Strong can be done anywhere, anytime, without additional equipment. Be Strong BFR is a promising solution for everyone to reap the benefits of regular exercise. And we like to think of it as a great anti-aging medicine. And with that, thank you for your attention, and we'll take some questions. Yeah, let's use the microphone, and then.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation. I do have a question. Once you stop doing this training, how long do the results persist?
I would say similar to other sorts of training. So if you stop doing whatever, generally in 2 weeks, you've lost a lot of the effect that you've gotten.
Okay.
So. There is a question up here.
So if I have my normal weightlifting routine, I could use these straps and use the same weights, and then I would have to go down in weights to get the benefit.
So what I would recommend is that you put the bands on, and then you take approximately 30% or 33% of the weights you normally use, and do the same exercises, and you'll get the same benefits with a third less weight and less wear and tear, and in a shorter period of time. But the key to all these workouts is going to failure. And it's hard to go to failure with heavy weights. You lose control of the weight and drop it on your foot or somewhere.
What is the relationship of occlusion pressure to central venous pressure?
Well, there's a couple ways of answering that. So firstly, if we take the condition of having a band on your arm, the pressures that are inside the inflatable part are way higher than any kind of venous pressure. So let's say your venous pressure at the level of your heart standing up is approximately 40 millimeters of mercury. The pressures that we put in the bands on the arms can go up to 300. But that's the pressure that's in the inflatable cuff. That's not exactly the pressure that's impinging on that vein. And what we do is we find ways that we find the balance between mean arterial pressure and mean venous pressure such that when they're at rest, we're occluding the venous side, but we're allowing the arterial side to stay patent. And then what happens is when you have muscle contraction, that pressure generated by the muscle overwhelms the venous occlusion and causes a return of the venous blood to the heart. So we really don't have any, it's hard to get pressure measurements right at these things. We could try to do that with putting in some catheters and pressure sensors, but we really haven't done that. We empirically are able to see that we maintain arterial inflow. You put these bands on and you check your pulse and you've got a pulse, so the artery's patent. And we know that from the engorgement of the veins on the venous side that we are distending the venous side, but that we know we empty it and we overcome the venous blockade with muscle contraction.
2 more questions.
Yeah.
You've talked about strength and muscle mass. What about the effects of this kind of training on endurance?
On the what?
On endurance.
Oh, endurance. Yes, there actually are 2 publications which show that by doing a program like this, you can improve VO2 max. There was a very nice study that was done in the August Krogh Institute in Denmark where they basically put femoral artery and femoral vein catheters into a subject who was doing bicycle exercise and measuring the blood flow that was going in there and the oxygen consumption. If you have arterial and venous blood gases, you can see what the oxygen uptake was, and that a program of blood flow restriction training improved the oxygen uptake out of that muscle. So it's likely, or the way that we would do this is that if you're, like in those Iranian rats, the idea was that they had these rats walking on a treadmill. They improved their treadmill walking performance by doing this, and even with their femoral arteries tied off. So I would say that the kind of training you do dictates the kind of benefits you get. So a lot of this started out with weightlifting, so you get better at weightlifting. When you're doing this stuff whether it's cycling or running or cross-country skiing or speed skating, you get better at these endurance events.
One more question.
I get in trouble whoever I choose. Yeah.
I know, super, thanks. Well, and I had a multi-pronged question, and so answer whichever parts you have time for. I thought one of the citations, I thought maybe it said 2000, so I wondered if some of the research had been around for that long, and if that's the case, I think this is super exciting, super impressive results, and so why hasn't it been picked up in mainstream? Why don't we hear about more professional teams
Excellent
engaging it, professional triathletes, other athletes? And then do you know of any place locally where there's physical therapy or someplace where it's available other than for home use?
Yeah, great questions. You're very right. That study I showed you on efficacy where you had the 4 panels with the weightlifting, that was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in the year 2000 by the Japanese group that was doing this. Since then, it's been, this technique has not really gotten out of Japan for many, many years. It was really not until 2007 or 8 that it really started getting into North America. People poo-pooed it, and they said, well, this can't work, and blah, 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 blah. And then there's another complication that because they couldn't get a hold of the Japanese equipment, they started using their own stuff, and they weren't getting the same results the Japanese were getting with their stuff. And so it's just starting now, I would say starting in about 2012, it started to gain some traction in North America. We happen to have all sorts of this gear outside in the lobby. So, and we've written our app such that you don't need to have some expert to help you with it. So we feel that it's a self-contained situation right here, and all you need is a credit card.
All right. On that happy note, let's thank our speaker.
All right.